The Supreme Court's decision to gut Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is not just encouraging Democrats to redistrict themselves, it's also renewing calls within the party to pack the court. And there is still a question, of course, that remains of whether moderate Democrats, if given the power to do so, have an appetite for reforming the courts in that way. Joining us, reporter at The Bulwark, Lauren Egan, founder and president of the Searchlight Institute, and former chief of staff for Senator John Fetterman, Adam Gentleson. Elaine Kamarck still with us. Lauren, this is your reporting. What do you got?
Yeah, Katie, thanks for having me. Look, I think this VRA ruling last week really was kind of a jolt for some Democrats who feel like the Supreme Court has just increasingly become a partisan actor. Obviously, this decline in trust in the Supreme Court has been going on for years, but that VRA ruling is essentially going to end Black political power in the South as we know it, and that's landing really heavy in the Democratic Party. And folks that I talked to in the Democratic Party kind of said, look, we've reached a point where we have to seriously consider real court reform. This was obviously a conversation that was happening in the 2020 Democratic primary, but it was kind of on the fringes. Joe Biden, who obviously won that primary, never really embraced court reform. He's kind of the institutionalist, and that was his whole brand. But when I talked to folks in South Carolina, which, as we know, it is the first primary state that, of course, could change going into 2028. But let's say South Carolina is the first primary state. When I was talking with officials in South Carolina, they said, look, this is a state with a lot of Black Democratic primary voters. They're going to want answers from these candidates that are coming already to this state to visit. They're going to want answers about how they plan to restore the VRA. And a key component of that is probably going to be some sort of court reform, whether that's expanding the court, term limits, what have you, but they're looking for answers.
Let me play the conversation, part of the conversation you had with Ro Khanna about this. Oh, you know, it's not a full conversation, it's a full screen. He said to you, the Supreme Court is totally out of touch with the racism that still exists and racially polarized voting in the Deep South. They dealt a severe blow to the next generation of Black leadership. We must have term limits on justices and look at expanding the court. Reforming the court must be one of the highest Democratic priorities. Again, so that's, repeating much of what you were saying there, Lauren. I wonder, the question we asked at the beginning is whether moderates are going to have an appetite for this. And Adam, you're well positioned to answer that for me. And by the way, I just want to say, as we're talking about this, Tennessee has just approved its new maps, and it's a wipeout, 9-0, 9 Republican districts, 0 Democratic districts in that state.
Yeah, I mean, what you just described, and then, the court's ruling last week, I think moderates are more willing to consider a much wider array of reforms than they were even a few years ago. And I think that's due to the extreme politicization we've seen of redistricting and of the Supreme Court itself. And so this notion that the Supreme Court is an apolitical actor, that it is independent, has really taken a huge blow due to the way that this conservative majority has conducted itself, being extremely sort of transparently political in its rulings, veering one way or the other depending on the outcome that they wanted to find, rather than sort of being consistent in applying judicial principles or neutrality. And I think that's opened their minds to sort of a broader array of reforms. I think you still are going to struggle to get to a majority for something like expanding the court if you have sort of a very narrow Senate majority of 51 seats or 52 seats. I think if any sort of major reform to the courts is going to require Democrats to win many more Senate seats, somewhere in the range of 55, 56, 57, somewhere approaching a supermajority to actually have the votes to pass something like that. Because I think inevitably there will be defections, and you have to compensate for that in the number of seats that you win.
So, Elaine, is there anything else beyond adding more Supreme Court justices that the Democrats might pursue?
Well, I think term limits on Supreme Court justices is something that the Democrats might pursue, or age limits, something like that. I mean, given the problem with Joe Biden and how he aged right before us and had to drop out of the presidential race, I think that given that experience, a lot of Americans are saying, maybe we ought to look seriously at either age limits or term limits or something like that. So I think that's probably more reasonable, maybe more doable than actually adding more justices. Remember that Franklin Roosevelt, the hero, one of our great presidents, couldn't manage to expand the Supreme Court. So I don't know that anybody else coming up will.
Can you argue, Elaine, or do you believe that the court does need to be expanded given this moment?
I think either expand. I do, and I'm a big moderate Democrat. Always have been. I think that this is really not. They are really not representing the United States of America in its totality, and that it does need to change somehow, either expanded or term limited or age limited or something. Because if we go on like this, they are fundamentally out of step with where America is. We saw that when they repealed Roe v. Wade, and we're seeing it again in many other decisions.
Is this something that Democrats feel comfortable, Lauren, campaigning on? I'm hearing Ro Khanna talk about it. Are other Democrats going to be using this on the campaign trail?
That's a really good question. I think that there's still some uncomfortableness with talking about this publicly. Some Democratic strategists that I spoke with said, I actually kind of wish that we wouldn't talk about this publicly. I just want us to do this once Democrats have a trifecta again. So there is some recognition in that even though Democrats, I think, as Adam kind of spoke to, that this is becoming more mainstream, these ideas, there is some recognition that it could potentially be politically toxic or just a bit controversial in some competitive parts of the country. So Ro Khanna obviously very comfortable talking about this, but I think we still have a long way to go to see other Democrats, other potential 2028 candidates fully embrace this in a really public way.
Let me play Chief Justice John Roberts talking about how he, I'm going to actually read it, how he sees the courts. He says, I think at a very basic level, people think we're making policy decisions. We're saying we think this is how things should be, as opposed to what the law provides, he said. I think they view us as purely political actors, which I don't think is an accurate understanding of what we do. Elaine, do you think that's fair?
No, I mean, I think that they are acting as purely political actors. They're overturning precedent right and left, and that's where I go back to the decision on abortion. That was, first of all, many years ago. The entire society had incorporated it, was acting on it, and they overturned it and went back and redid the whole decision. That's not the way the court usually operates. And so I think that they have become politicized. And by the way, whether or not this can be done is one question. But I don't think it hurts Democrats to run on this, because I think our base, our African-American base, is so outraged by this decision, the Louisiana v. Calais. They are so outraged by it that it is only good for Democrats to draw attention to it.